Good evening and welcome to the South African Equestrian Federation podcast from the horse's mouth. I am your host, Georgie Roberts. And tonight for episode 11, we're talking about deworming done right. Is your deworming routine helping or hindering your horse? We all obviously want the absolute best for our horses. So we got you the absolute best to come into the studio tonight. We have Dr. Karl van Laeren, who is, Karl, are you based in Zimbabwe at the moment? But a 43-year practitioner of equine veterinary, also with a keen interest in wildlife, which is quite interesting besides the worm wildlife. And then Dr. Alison Dallas, who, of course, with partner Dr. Rissa Parker, is the owner of the Glen Austin Veterinary Equine Clinic, and herself a 20-year veterinary veteran in the equine community up here in Johannesburg. So thank you both for joining us in studio tonight. You've had a busy day so far at the South African Veterinary Congress, I believe.
Yeah, I've been addressing the Congress on matters of anthelmintic resistance to principally our ivermectins, oxydectin. It's a scary situation.
That's fantastic. Well, I mean, it's not fantastic, but I'm really glad to have you here because I'm really looking forward to discussing that. Karl, but can you tell everyone who is listening so far, and I just want to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please take advantage of this and leave your questions in the live chat. How did you come to have such a keen interest and now so much experience in parasitology?
Yeah, so growing up or practicing in Zimbabwe, dewormers weren't readily available like they are in South Africa. You can't go to your feed store and pick up whatever flavored deworming you might wish to give your horse. You had to come to us, to your veterinarian. We had a limited supply, so we had to prioritize which horses needed to be dewormed and which ones didn't. So in order to do that, we would have to do a worm egg count. And the important thing was to do a worm egg count that was cheaper than the deworming. So you could sell a worm egg count. And in that way, we realized that less than 20% of our horses actually needed to be dewormed. And it's grown from there. And then finally, we realized that the dewormers we were using were not working as effectively as they should have. So way back in 1999, we found that ascrid worms, which we'll talk about, are becoming resistant to ivermectin. And Georgie, that was 3 years before it got published out of Holland and 4 years out of Canada. So we were ahead of the curve.
That's fascinating.
Little old Zimbabwe. So
that's great. So that's interesting because when I started like my journey with horses about 15 years ago, I remember we would just routinely deworm every 3 months, and you would rotate your dewormers. But there was no such thing as doing the egg counts. So is that what's led to the current problem?
I mean, we've been in a hugely privileged position. When I started to practice, we had to deworm horses with a stomach tube and mixed panicure and pyrazine, and we put Negavon P in for bots. So you have a tail that you had to tube into the horse. And that all changed with the arrival of ivermectin and then
these pastes
on oxydectin. So it became a lot easier to manage with. And these were truly broad spectrum dewormers. Nowadays, the word broad spectrum is a myth of the past. It doesn't
touch sides.
I'm covering bases.
And so what are the challenges that are facing horse owners when it comes to deworming and managing parasites nowadays?
It's just how complex the situation has become. A lot of us are still confident that we can overcome parasites. We know how to overcome them. But I assure you, you need to rethink the situation. It isn't easy. So many different parasites that are becoming enemies, that are becoming resistant, and needed an alternative approach. There's gone are the days where one dewormer will sort out all your.
And how does this resistance build up in the parasites?
There are many ways in which it can build up, partly because of over deworming and underdosing and allowing pastures to build up with parasites, and that just sets the stage. And then if you're not testing, you're confident that you're ahead of the problem. You might in time find a dead horse due to an ascrid impaction. Then that you realize, you get that wake-up call that one needs to do something.
The horse is bolted from the stable.
I think one of those big problems, as you said, is alternating deworming. I was a younger vet. We all put our bodies on the line and deworm right, there's a gastric tube, 60 horses, healthy
Yeah,
horses
in one go.
Then the paste became available, and a lot of different generic paste became available. People thought they were alternating, but it was just
That's
a
a great
different
point.
name
Name brand.
with the same active ingredient. And then a lot of the generic pastes, we found also the consistency of the paste was not great. So as Karl says, underdosing. So if you had a difficult horse that didn't like oral treatments, it would spit half of the treatment out. So now you've underdosed it, and you've used the same
Without realizing it.
active ingredient for treatments in a row. So that's how I think the.
I mean, just on a tangent, this is how antibiotic resistance also builds up. Is that
We've
okay?
also got a huge.
Okay. Okay.
Everybody's fully aware of just how serious the antibiotic resistance is, but they're not as aware that anthelmintic resistance is also becoming much more prevalent. And I think, Georgie, we've got 4 different classes of dewormer. That's all. When it comes to antibiotics, there may be 16 to 20 different classes.
That's really interesting.
Multi-drug. We've only got 4. There's nothing new coming up on the pipeline.
What are the 4 go-to?
So the macrocytic lactones are divided into 2. So there's ivermectin and abamectin on the one side that works 12 weeks, should work for them, sorry. And then moxidectin at 12 weeks. That's your macrocytic lactones. Then you get piperazine, which is a grounds, and it's largely deregistered in many other countries. Fortunately, it's still working in us in South Africa.
Why is it deregistered in other places?
They just didn't feel they needed it anymore.
Okay.
Whereas we're having to rely more on this 1950 drugs this day and age. And then there's pyrantel pomade, which is sol.
Okay.
There's the benzimidazole, Panacur, fenbendazole.
Okay.
Those are the 4 dewormers.
And between those 4, we have to knock out how many species of worms?
Well, small strong guards, there's probably between 40 species of. Then there's nematodes, which are flukes, that where it hosts a cell. And there's tapeworm.
Okay.
So there's,
Delicious.
I would say, 50 species of worm, and that's also where the problem arises, because you can get immunity to worms. Horses, a bit of exposure can get immunity, but we're all aware that
when you say immunity to worms,
sort of a resistance,
okay,
a proper immunity like
they
you
live
get.
quite happily with them. They look.
So it becomes like, so they don't show any symptoms. That's interesting.
As the counts drop, the parasite numbers do drop, but if we're talking 40 to 50 species, we think African horse sickness. We're trying to get immunity to 9 strains of African horse sickness, and it takes some years to get to that point. When you're talking 50 species of parasite, it's also going to take some years. But you do see as horses age, and they've been allowed to harbor a few low numbers of parasites, the immunity does kick in as they age. Then there comes a time when they're really old and geriatric. Maybe they get a bit of Cushing's disease, also known as PID, which pushes up the cortisone levels, and then the parasites return as old. They have a problem as young horses, and then they can have a problem as old.
So am I hearing you say that you don't actually want a 0 egg count necessarily?
No. It's a few worms are potentially beneficial. It's natural. Horses have evolved have this mindset that want to eradicate
them to be clean.
Every worm in the planet out of our horses. That's
Karl, listen, I've gained a few kilos. I would love to have a couple of worms living in me. I would like to just hang on to a couple. That would really help.
Yeah. Thanks. Georgia, we don't try and get rid of all the bacteria in our bodies.
No.
Why are we trying to get rid of every single worm?
And it's been really interesting with kids growing up in this COVID age of over sanitizing and all the antibacterial, whatever soaps.
Yeah.
That they've been trying to, and you generally, I think, can see the children who have been raised in this more sterile environment as opposed to the children who've been eating Simba chips off of the floor.
The hygiene hypothesis.
Oh, is that what it's called?
So that kids that grow up on farms seldomly get asthma.
Oh, interesting.
Whereas
City kids. Well, there we go.
I don't want to leave you with the concept that worms are
great.
desirable.
No.
I just want to keep check on where we are.
So what is when a horse comes to you for an egg count? Maybe I'm jumping the gun here. What is the ideal So what's the protocol? An owner will collect some manure.
Question. So basically, I'd like look at the history on the yard and say, well, all right, if you've dewormed your horses with ivermectin, you should have 8 weeks of cover. So then don't send me poo for at least a month afterwards. So send me poo from 12 weeks after an ivermectin or abamectin. You've used oxydectin, which is best, or pegfest, then you should get 12 weeks of cover. So send me poo a month after the 12-week window is closed at 16 weeks. So that's when you start to look to see whether you've got a problem or whether you haven't got a problem. And then you want to see that whatever dewormer you choose to use actually affect.
And what should egg counts be? Is that too technical a question?
No. Every practice, veterinary practice, every country seems to have their own standards of how many parasites they will tolerate. Recently been involved with the British Equine Veterinary Association setting guidelines for England, and they are pushing up the bar. They used to be at about 200, 250. Now they feel that they should tolerate counts up to 500.
500 eggs per gram of
that should be tolerated. We don't.
Wow.
We're not as lenient as that.
Okay.
I use 350 because that's what we got taught when I was at Ondersupport.
Okay.
And so I'm comfortable that if a horse has got less than 350 eggs per gram, it's got potentially a lesser burden, and therefore there's very little chance of illness. However, if there's parasites like ascrids, even one ascrid egg or one gastrodis egg, we will nuke that.
Okay.
We won't tolerate any ascrids or gastrodis.
And why is that?
We just feel like ascrid eggs comes in a really thick shell, a casing, and it's got a gelatinous covering, which allows it to adhere to balls and to mangers or to the mare's udder. And the little larvae develops in this thick casing. It can persist in the environment, I'm told, for up to 10 years. 10 years.
10 years.
Once an ascrid egg is laid in the environment, it could persist for up to 10 years. That's never been proven in the literature, but clearly it's quite a resilient little chap. And then
So you just don't want it to get a foothold.
And that's one of the ones that we had big problems.
Okay.
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 Young.
So a question that was given to me to ask is, and it's interesting that you say the horses can have quite a significant egg or worm count and still look well. What are the negative health ramifications of worm infestations, and how will people be able to identify it themselves?
Yeah, so the general consensus is that worms cause weight loss. They may cause weight loss, but by and large, and heavy burdens can be seen and will be seen in very fat horses. You just feed a little bit extra. You feed horse and for the worms.
Yeah.
And,
Meanwhile, your horse only needed this much food, but you're feeding worms a kilo.
And my understanding of most roundworms is that they live off bacteria. They don't live off the horse's food. They live off the bacteria in the intestine. So, therefore, they rarely have serious impact on the body score. There are exceptions, obviously. Worms that do a lot of damage to the intestine are more likely to cause weight loss. But surprising how many horses with high worm burdens are pretty good. So just to be able to say, well, this horse looks wormy, I
Can't really say that.
I
Okay.
think sometimes the gastrodiscus cases have poor condition. Out of all of the parasites, that gastrodiscus is most likely to weight loss, but not always necessarily.
Okay.
No, gastrodiscus is the exception to the rule because it tends to bite a little piece of mucosa out of the cecum or the ventral colon, and then it takes another bite next door, and that little can ooze protein and blood and can allow bacteria and endotoxins and make them sick.
Sure.
Gastrodiscus is a new guy on the block.
And then what are some of the pathologies that can arise from, besides, as you say, like the horses could get systemically sick? Is colic a big one for worm infestations?
Colic used to be. In the old days, we all grew up with a Strongylus vulgaris, the red worm, large, strong guy. That used to be ingested as an infective larvae off the grass and they penetrate the small intestine. migrate up the arteries, go and lodge itself where the cranial mesenteric artery enters the aorta, the big artery that supplies the back leg, the heart. It would go and live there. It would irritate the out of the blood vessel, causing a thrombosis. The thrombosis would emboli. It'd be embolic showers would come moving down the arteries and cause like a little gut attack, equivalent of a human heart attack, but this time in the gut. And if the embolus is big enough, it's a fairly large area of damage. That landed up.
That's so interesting. I thought that the only way that it happened was from an impaction, as we were discussing earlier.
And the nice thing, Georgina, is that that Strongylus vulgaris, that bad parasite of the past, has largely been eliminated by ivermectin. There's a good aspect to this tale. Strongylus is no more very prevalent. That type of colic is not seen very often anymore. Other types of colic.
So once you've done your test in horses, they've sent you the manure, you've tested, you obviously then identify which worm is causing the problem, and that will decide then on the worming protocol.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So in the old days, you could just grab an ivermectin or amoxidectin and shove it down your horse's mouth. Broad spectrum, rest in peace. It don't exist anymore. It should be taken off the labeling because the playing field has changed so much.
Okay. I wanted to ask you something that's gone right out of my head. So a question is, can I send just a random selection of horses samples from a yard for testing and then get an idea of how to treat the entire yard? So obviously a cost-saving exercise.
There's no shortcuts in this.
Okay.
Because if I look at Gauteng as a whole, the sport horse aspect of Gauteng, we're finding that 3.4% of the horses are carrying worms at 350 and above. So it's extremely low incidence in top-end yards because the pasture hygiene have been regularly passed. So we're just going to cherry pick and take a few horses and say, well, this represents the entire table way off the.
So when you start, you should really, as a yard, if you're going to send in your first batch of droppings and for egg counts, you send every single horse in a little bag, labeled, and then identify the problem horses. And then from on, to save money, you check
those
some of
horses,
the problem horses, and then maybe do the whole yard once a year, and then problem horses more regularly.
I suppose also with if you're identifying where the worms are coming from and hanging out, and then also because we have generally in competition yards horses going to individual paddocks, hopefully they're in the same paddock, unless they're sharing paddocks, that would be the way of tracking and then maybe testing their paddock mates.
I think that's why the situation is so ultra clean in Gauteng, because they're individual small little paddocks. There might not be much grass. So it's fairly worm hostile, those paddocks. It's sand, sun bakes down on it. Worms don't enjoy hot and dry. They enjoy cool pastures, moisture. When the rainy season comes is when the worms because rain and the heat encourages.
That was when we would typically then do our blind deworming, was in spring, as you said, when the rains came, and that would be okay.
So to take this one point further, you could, if you've got an ultra clean yard where historically is always one or two out of it, could potentially pool samples to save money. Well, now our yard is largely a clean yard, so we throw 3 horses together in one envelope. We know that A, C went in the envelope. If they're 0, well, then all 3 of them are 50. Well, one of them is higher.
What is the cost of a worm egg count? I was just going to say, I mean, it's a dewormer nowadays. I'm not really sure what they go for, but it must be a couple of $100. And then you're looking at an egg count for about 70 Rand.
I think that's the problem with marketing wormers or marketing the count, is that count must be seen to be cost effective. The count is hugely more expensive.
They're not going to do it.
There's not going to be much incentive.
It's more expensive if you test for the gastro as well.
Okay.
But it's quite worthwhile to test for somewhere down the line. a flay environment.
And we do actually have quite a few of
We
those
do
in
have
Gauteng.
a lot of wet.
I mean,
we're running ahead of ourselves a little
sorry,
bit.
we are. So many vets recommend treatment with moxidectin, which is the Equest or the PegaQuest, to aid in prevention of acute larval cyatostominosis.
So, got it, spot on.
What is your take on this? And I just want to understand the cyatostominosis is the encapsulated, is that what I'm thinking
Yeah,
of?
so acute larval cyatostominosis is the mass emergence of parasites in such numbers and in such a way that they make the horse ill. So there's just like mass panic in the gut.
Okay.
And all these little cyatostomes want to leave now. And there's not enough exit portals. It's like mass hysteria in a sports stadium.
Okay.
And causes a problem. Fortunately, but over dramatized, can I say? It's a rare condition. It only occurs in young horses, 1.5 years and 6 years of age. It normally occurs sort of in winter. It doesn't occur over all age groups. It is virtually a young horse disease.
And pasture kept young horses, or is it?
No, it can be
anything?
pasture kept. And sometimes a deworming can trigger it, because it's a bit like these adult worms live in the intestine, and you come in with an ivermectin dewormer, you remove the adults.
Okay.
The youngsters who are in an arrested stage of development in the intestinal wall get this message: the adults are gone, and it's like delinquent teenagers. They send out this message to their mates, get on the
Come on, we're going out.
We're going out to have a party, and we've got the key for the pub. So,
yes, that's not good news for anyone.
Yeah, if you've got those sort of delinquents, then you could end up in a trouble situation if you've got young horses.
Okay.
But they don't act as delinquents in older horses. So
that's
just
interesting.
To put it a little bit, it's fascinating.
Why not?
Parasite. Don't ask me.
That's interesting.
But it's a young horse disease.
Okay.
You get a good feel for whether it's likely to be imminent in a yard or not. Once you've tested a yard a few times, you get a pretty good feel that there's a big cadre of immature worms that keep appearing, suggesting that
the population
the yard has got.
And what number would you be looking for in that fecal sample that would be your warning?
That's hard to tell, because you just don't know how many are encysted. But I can say, there's a parasitology expert in Kentucky, Martin Nielsen, and he puts out YouTube videos on parasites, and he's Danish, and he's immigrated to Kentucky, and he's put out a YouTube video. In 9 years in Kentucky, hadn't seen a single case of equine larval cyatostominosis in America. And put it into perspective. Into medicalize this condition.
I love that phrase. I think they say when you hear hoofbeat, don't assume it's a zebra. It's probably a horse. So we do tend to. And I had a cousin who was a med student, and he was 5th year, and he was learning about brain tumors, and he came home and he went, I've got a brain tumor. And my aunt said, are you sure you don't just maybe have a headache? Not need a glass of water. He was like, no, I've got a brain tumor. And it's so it obviously is. It's exciting to go for the most dramatic option, I think, sometimes. And let's be honest, horses are quite dramatic animals, I think. Oh. So in your recent newsletter, you wrote about the ineffectiveness of panicure against strong gals. Can you give us the reasons for this view, considering that many vets do recommend 5-day panicure followed by moxidectin?
So in about 2011, a paper came out of Kentucky where they looked at 5 days of panicure. It was largely ineffective. And thinking is that it's hard to find populations of horses that are fully susceptible and responsive to panicure or to fenbendazole nowadays. It's a rarity to find yards where there isn't resistance. So if there's resistance, it doesn't matter whether 5 days, 50 days, 500 days, or what dose you treat them, it's resistance. And so that's the reason why don't really support the 5-day panicure treatment. Moxidectin is effective, so I think the guys who use 5 days of panicure and then
Amoxicillin.
oxydectin on day 6 to get out of jail.
Day 6 was the success story,
Success,
not day
but
1
not
to
the
5.
panic cure. So,
Okay.
yeah, if you're going to do the 5-day panic cure, by all means try it, but I think do a worm egg count, and then do a worm egg count 10 days after the last deworming, the 5th deworming dose. Then
Okay.
work out for yourself whether it's effective for your situation or not.
Are there any barriers to entry with having egg counts done? Are egg counts hard to do? I know you've got a lab now in Gauteng, and people can ship from around Southern Africa to you, correct?
And there's a lot of labs. I'm not the only lab. So, there are a number of people that are offering the service. So the last thing I want to take away from this podcast is that
There's only one place doing it.
no,
Okay.
no, there's
So all I'm saying is that they're
many
not really
places.
barriers to entry to do the egg
shouldn't
counts.
be.
It's just breaking. It's change management, which is
Yes.
always hard.
The barrier will be us,
Okay.
the human, wanting
And
to.
I
We
think one
don't
of
do
the
change well.
important things, I was going to discuss it later, but it's for samples cold. Because otherwise the eggs hatch.
I was actually going to say that when you said, I'm thinking about the logistics of collecting these big yards, like the racing yards at Rankiesfontein, and should people be walking around with a Ziploc bag and a cooler box? Is that the best way to collect?
You want to keep the sample cold from hatching,
Okay.
but these worms are extremely resilient. They will hatch if they're warm.
If I collected 60 samples and I came back and there was 60 like poo samples worth of worms that had hatched in my car, I would just have to sell the car. This is sounding horrifying. Do they really hatch in the bags?
No.
Oh,
And
good.
they
Okay.
take-
I'm relieved about it.
they
I'm
take-
looking at the giant worms over there and I'm thinking if I saw that in my car, I would just leave.
They take a few days to hatch.
Okay. Okay. But then you're not getting an effective count. You're not.
No, you can. If
Okay.
you do a different test, a sedimentation test, because now the egg won't float because it hatched. It's a heavier
Okay.
parasite, so it will sink. So we have a test where we can look for larvae that have hatched and left the
Okay.
case.
Okay. Okay. I'm feeling better about that now. And I see you've got a jar of it here. Gastrodiscus is the parasite that keeps popping up. I'd never heard of it before.
Discus, out of one horse.
What is it? One horse.
One horse.
That's just a little
Sample.
of what
Yeah,
came
no,
out
you
of
can
it.
get a lot more. This is probably only 10% of what can be in a horse.
So where do they come from? Like this is and what's the challenges they're causing now?
Yeah, so it used to be present in the Drakensberg areas and the foothills of Lesotho. That was its historic distribution, and in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And now it seems to be all over in the Gauteng area. I think these horses have brought gastrodiscus in. The snails were here. The snails have acted as intermediate hosts. Now a lot of these properties have got really big.
Is this what you were saying are the marshy properties?
Yes.
So that's where the snails are living and okay. And are the horses then accidentally eating a snail? Or is it
No, so this is the snail. It's a real small little critter.
that's amazing.
It's not
Yeah.
the size of a domestic snail.
Okay.
And if one were to put the snail on one's hand with the spire away from me, and then look where the aperture is, the opening.
Yes.
If the opening is pointing to the left, it's a gastrodiscus snail.
Okay.
The same size snail with the aperture pointing to the right is the liver fluke snail. So people sometimes
that's
get
amazing.
confused between liver fluke and gastrodiscus. But I enjoy natural history, and so I've enjoyed
That's great.
looking at the snails and trying to work out
Which one?
And even we can test the snails for gastrodiscus. We don't need to test the horse.
Oh, okay.
Some of my wildlife properties, where horses have, where people have horses and they have wildlife, we say to them, well, just test some fresh poo from zebra or warthog on your
Oh, that's
property,
amazing.
because they also carry gastrodiscus. So one can easily get an idea of the zebra or the warthog whether they need to be
Okay.
looking at it in their horses. Because if it's not in your zebra, it won't be in your horses, in that
Okay.
water body.
Okay. And then what are the problems that gastrodiscus, how are horses presenting with this? I know that, you just hear these horror stories. Oh, I've lost a horse to gastrodiscus, was fine, then just dead.
And there
You
are
know?
horror stories
So,
like that.
okay.
So Ondersupport published about 6 horses that they diagnose gastrodiscus on the operating table, because when they get a heavy infection of gastrodiscus in their cecum, the cecum can intercept into the colon, end up with a really serious colic, a very toxic horse, and the gut is telescoped into another part of the gut. So gastrodiscus does kill a few horses every year. And because it's a big parasite, just see, it looks like a little turtle with a head on it.
It looks like a little stingray. Yeah.
And so that little head suckers into the intestine, creates a little lesion, and that lesion, when you deworm a horse blindly, trying to get rid of gastrodiscus, leaves a little bleeding lesion, and those horses can get quite sick if they've got a heavy infection. So one needs to be pretty cautious how you manage heavy infections of gastrodiscus.
But you said testing for them is not as straightforward as the other ones.
No, it needs a different type of test, a different microscope. Its egg is quite heavy, so it sinks. You can't test for it in the same test that you do for roundworms.
These are the worms you said horses will sometimes actually look a bit ropey when they're carrying.
Yes, the gastrodiscus result in weight loss and poor coat.
Sometimes a cow pad like dung. Colicky symptoms.
And then the treatment protocol for gastrodiscus?
So a lot of people use gastrodiscus and liver fluke interchangeably. So liver fluke has about 5 different dewormers that you can use for liver fluke. Of those 5 different dewormers you can use for liver fluke, only one will work for gastrodiscus. So if you're using them interchangeably, there is only one dewormer, and that's oxyclosanide, that will work on both liver
and gastrodiscus.
And that's not
label. So and are there challenges with using an off-label products with horses then,
So it's a legal implication. So if you use an off-label product and something goes wrong, you as a vet are liable for complications unless you to use the drug that's.
And how do we, in the grander scheme of things, how do we overcome that? Do we get the drug registered for horses? Will that ever happen, or?
That's an exciting thing.
Depressing.
Onerous. So, and most of the drug company horses are such a small portion of their turnover that they're really interested.
That's interesting.
Registering it. Supposed to use.
And it's only a disease in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and there's a little bit of it maybe along the Nile, and so it has very small impact on the drug company.
So, Karl, what I hear you telling me is we need to take some gastrodiscus into Dubai. Is that what you're saying? Just blink once for yes. I'm joking. I'm joking. For legal reasons, I'm joking. Charlene, don't fire me. Can we go from that onto the other worms that are culprits? I don't know if you want to go onto the slides.
Yeah, let's touch on the slides quickly.
And everyone can have a look at what they're dealing with.
So this is the parasite we see the most of.
But
having said that, of all the tests we've done in South Africa in the last 3 years, we've done just over 15,000 worms tests. We're seeing that only 13.5% of horses need to have counts over 300. To put it into perspective, it's still well below the 20. And this is the parasite we're looking at. But the test will also pick up ascarids, which is a foal worm, and it'll pick up tapeworm.
So the same test for that, ascarids and tapeworms.
So
those are the
foal ascarids. They look like.
Are those the ones that are in your jar there as well?
So those are from that post-mortem.
Oh, really?
Down from Colic. That's just a small
really?
Worms.
And what happened? So you said it was a post-mortem. You just.
So
shame.
Unfortunately, by the time it arrived,
for surgery.
It was too far gone. And put it down and did it.
This is also a post-mortem. It got presented to my hospital, and before we could do much of a heart rate or temperature, it got up in there and fell down dead, and it had this severe impaction from ascarid worm. And this was in 2004. So it was, in fact, 5 years after we started to tell clients you can't use macrocystobacter.
You need it.
2 deworm.
So, and is this, if you open up a horse on the table And this is, you said earlier on, which is going to give me vivid nightmares, that you opened up a horse for colic surgery and these worms just started coming out. Is it possible to do a manual cleanup of that and then sew the horse back up and they'll be okay?
The ideal technique is to try and milk them out of the impacted small intestine and into the cecum, not to open the small intestine, because you tend to get adhesions. So a lot of the cases that get opened up to try and remove the worms don't live for more than a year after the surgery. So if you can, if you've catched them before the gut is devitalized and you can milk small intestine empty of these parasites, quite a job, because
I'm
it can be rock hard in there with them impacted. But to put it into perspective for your members, this is not a parasite they're going to see a lot of in horses that are over 2 or 3 years of age. We are seeing it in a few older horses, but it's primarily a parasite of foals at its highest prevalence at around about weaning. So you have the stress of weaning and the stress of a heavy parasite burden.
That's something that we'd see a lot on the stud farm.
Okay.
Is a problem.
I suppose with those big pastures, pasture management also becomes a bit trickier. As for horses, great for worms.
Pinworms, thing that makes horses rub their tails. So it's important to differentiate a horse that's just rubbing his tail from a horse that's rubbing his tail and his mane, because that's sweet. Something else, that's a allergy. But if they're just rubbing their tails, then you need to consider pinworms. Unfortunately, pinworms are showing resistance to ivermectin again. So again, that broad spectrum claim is a bit of a myth of the past.
So how are you treating pinworms?
Good question, because it's hard to know what's effective, because you don't see pinworm eggs in the dung. The pinworm eggs are laid in the perineum around the anus.
So is this the one you have to test with sticky tape?
That's correct. You need to do a sticky tape test. Normally the eggs are laid between the 3 and the 6 o'clock position. They're laid at night. I'm impressed how these little parasites that live in the darkness of the rectum. No, it's nighttime.
They come out at night?
They come out at night and they lay their eggs in the lower half of
maybe it's lighter outside than it is, like inside than it is outside.
I think it's maybe to do with pressure, the sphincter pressure. The horses relax lying down.
Maybe.
The pressure is reduced.
That's interesting.
That's when it knows it's nighttime. Come out and lays eggs.
I love how much admiration you have for the worms, Karl. It's such a lovely.
Worms are my frenemies. They're half friend, they're half enemy. I'm just trying to work out when they become enemies.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, there's the line. Okay.
Tapeworms.
Jeez, is that the color of a tapeworm on the right?
That's they can be green in color, white in color. They often take on the color of the ingesta in the intestine. So that's why that one that uncovered in a gravy zebra in Kenya. And you just see how big they are. They're 80 centimeters long, the one species, and the other species is maybe about 6 centimeters long. So two different species of tapeworm. They're often incriminated to cause problems in the cecal valve. I must say that the good side of the story is that with endless use of dewormers that contain a tapeworm remedy in it called praziquantel, incidence has diminished in South Africa. I think we're sitting at seeing about less than 0.5%. So,
oh wow,
the worm count might not be that accurate because the eggs get deposited in little proglotted segments. They're like little envelopes. So if the poo that you're looking at is 1 or 2 or 3 days old, it's come from the Cape, so it's had a bit of a time to mature and ripen. As proglottids break open, they release the eggs. And so you're more likely to find positive eggs, I think, in manure that's a day or two old rather than fresh stuff that you've just put on the microscope. It's like raisins in a raisin loaf bread. You could take a dip at raisin loaf bread and not get a raisin.
Karl, you're ruining so many things for me tonight. There goes raisin bread out the window as well. That's a really lovely explanation. Thank you. That makes sense.
So, tapeworms, then a little gastrodiscus, the turtle with his...
That's what they look like when they're alive as opposed to... Okay.
So they're quite a big chap, and one parasite has an effect on the well-being of all.
Okay, so this is speaking now to the management of worms. So it's assuming that you've done your egg counts and your deworming. This is how you're ultimately going to prevent
one of the
it.
aspects.
Okay.
So you've got to approach the problem in the horse and realizing that 20% of the parasites are living in the horse, but 80% of them are free living in the environment. So you need to really approach both the environment, pasture, and the horse. Decide which horses to worm, and you need pasture hygiene.
So will you take us through this? So this is...
Yeah, so this was a trial that was published in a very good veterinary journal 2 years ago, and they had some ponies in England, and they divided them up into 3 groups, and the top group were ponies that never got dewormed, and their pastures, and they were kept in these pastures for 6 months, were never cleaned. So no deworming, no cleaning. And then the buildup of parasites on the grass. Then the middle group is what we would do largely, what many places used to do in the past, deworm every 8 weeks, for example, but very little paddock cleansing. And then the bottom group never got dewormed. Those 6 little ponies never got dewormed, but the pastures got cleaned twice a week. And so you can see there's
it's amazing.
Quite an impressive reduction in larvae. Only 5% of the larvae cleansed paddocks as opposed to the uncleansed.
Okay.
Then if you look at the worm egg count, other column, the trial was terminated after 6 months. So worm egg count does diminish. It has to diminish on ivermectin. The trial was done because ivermectin was working very, very well. Whereas the group that never got dewormed, they still had 891 worm egg counts on average. But had the trial continued for 2 years, worms only have a lifespan of about a year. So if they're picking up less from the pasture, their lifespan is a year, those counts would have been coming down.
That's really interesting. Oh, that would have been...
You've really got to approach the pasture as well as the horse nowadays.
We had a fly expert. I don't know what his correct title was. I'm sure that's not what he hopes to be going by for the rest of his life. But it was really interesting. We all moaning about the flies in Gauteng at the moment. And he said, you've got to remember that that's 20% of the fly population that you're seeing. You know, and the other 80 people were really clutching their pearls in horror. And again, it came down to, he said, you know, the manure, it's a pivotal part of really managing so much of the equine health system.
So this is just like to recap where we are, to put it into perspective, because I don't want people leaving with the idea that there's a massive plague of parasites in your horse. Generally isn't. By and large, we've done 10,500 tests, and 86% of the horses that we tested had no worms at all.
Jeez, that's amazing.
Then 13.5% had low egg counts, below what we felt needed. So that, sorry, reading wrong. 13.5% of what needed to be dewormed. 86% was 0 or very low counts.
Okay.
So you'll see 86 is actually 57.7 plus 29 is.
Okay.
And
so over half of horses had no eggs.
No eggs at all.
Sure.
And this is across the board in South Africa. This is foals, weanlings, yearlings, 2-year-olds, adult sport horses.
Oh, that's an interesting mix.
So it just goes to show you don't need.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's cheaper to not be actually, like you say, the cost has to outweigh the convenience.
And you don't want to be poisoning the environment with too much ivermectin deposited in the environment. It has negative knock-on effects.
Oh, does it?
Yes.
Okay.
So you can see the bottom line is like for Gauteng sport horses, we found 60 horses in need of deworming out of 1,701 tests at sport horses.
Okay.
Around venue.
That's really fascinating. So, but that said, the horses that do need deworming, you do need to be on top of it. I mean, the gastrodiscus is.
Well, this is roundworms. We're talking about roundworms.
Oh, is this just roundworms?
This is roundworms.
Okay.
Yeah, this is roundworms. And I think the concern is when you're bringing new horses in, getting horses from the racetrack or from a new venue, that you don't import a problem. Or worse still, a resistant problem. So quarantining that horse. If the horse arrives, you could potentially worm him with ivermectin or moxidectin. Probably beholds you to send a worm count on the day
Before
that you
doing
deworm it. Well, you could even say, well, I'm going to deworm, send a worm count in. If the count is high, at least you've got a starting point. Then in 10 days' time, you can see if you're effective. If it was effective, the horse is still the herd.
Okay.
Stable. If it isn't, you can add it till you get a satisfaction.
How long is so? And why is ivermectin your go-to of choice?
It's still the best dewormer we have.
Okay.
The scenario is changing, but at the moment it still is probably the best dewormer. I prefer it over moxidectin, but moxidectin has larvicidal effects. That's why it's an option. Together with the 5-day panic here, it's a better option. larvae, but it only kills 18% of the early third stage larvae in life cycle. So yes, it kills larvae, but it's
not the most effective.
It's still not the most effective. Okay. It still leaves a lot of parasites.
Okay.
So I feel like these larvae, as you said, they're semi-friends, and I feel we need to be working towards getting an immunity to the problem rather than trying to eradicate them by throwing a hand grenade in amongst these.
It's a very effective analogy.
You just got to keep the lid on the problem and then try and get immunity like we're trying to achieve with the sickness vaccine. Same thing.
Okay.
And I think we also, in a certain way, keep
pristine
from having too much resistance against it, because it is one little weapon in our arsenal, and we don't want to keep eradicate it. And we have recently some horses area they came in the area from another part of the country that is happens. Country, those are compatible with your.
And when you say there's resistance, you've taken the test, you've dewormed, you've taken another test, and there's not what you would classify as a significant enough reduction.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've worked with on those cases. There we've got back to old.
Okay.
You want to have a 95% reduction. So it means if you're starting off with 1,000 eggs, you will only tolerate 50 eggs 10 days later. If you've got more than 50 eggs, you haven't made the 95% clearance. You're less than that. So you're on the cusp. Things are beginning to change. And it's like a speedometer on a car. That slowly things begin to change from 100% effective, tolerate up to 95%. You lose the numbers and you've got to get into the 90%.
We do have a question here from Karen who says, are some horses' systems more conducive to worms than others? I have 4 mares living together as a herd and only one tested positive for worms.
Absolutely. Some horses are just immune cripples. They're just going to have worms. You're never going to get, there'll always be the wormy little guy in the group.
Okay.
So I see 2 horses in a paddock, and the one always has worms and the other one never has worms, and they share the same paddock. So yes, the immunity does vary.
Okay. Okay, no, sorry, that was not. When and why should retests be done on horses? Oh, sorry, do you want to speak about that?
Take your question. When and why? So when is 10 to 14 days later. I often see horses clear in 2 days, but we want to give it enough time to be sure that they have they've given them the best chance of clearing. So 10 days is about the minimum, and should be done within 20 days, because sometimes the parasites can be back in 28 days, new parasites from the environment. So you don't want to leave it too long. So that's when. And why? Doing a worm count is semi-important. Horses have evolved with worms. They're entitled to worms. It's not a game.
They're entitled to it.
Yeah. But what they're not entitled to is that when I want them to die by 95%, they must die to the tune of 95%. And if they're not, then I'm building up too many resistant worms. And this this decal shows the
Okay.
resistant worms. So we just don't want to have an overabundance of resistant worms. We want to stay within the parameters that we're comfortable with, which is a
Okay.
95% reduction.
Okay, so although larvae on the pasture derived from horse E may be resistant, the total pool of larvae on pasture is derived mostly from untreated horses. Okay.
Okay, so let me explain that now. So here you've got 4 horses sharing a pasture, 5 horses sharing a pasture. The horses that aren't in red, that are in black, have got low worm counts, say. They're all below 350 for argument's sake.
Okay.
And there's a bit of resistance appearing in this little herd of horses, and they're the red crosses. And by leaving the 4 with the low worm counts untreated, and only treating the 1 horse that has a high count above 350, you can see that the pool of parasites on the pasture still say largely as susceptible worms. So susceptible worm breeds with resistant worm, makes a hybrid worm that hopefully is still susceptible.
Okay.
So in this way, you're perpetuating the good genetic makeup and not driving yourself into a corner with only resistant worms. So that's the reason why one should tolerate low counts. And
so you're saying we can turn around the resistance, basically?
I don't think we can tame the resistance.
Okay.
But we can manage it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's hard to turn it around. You can reduce it, you can tame it. Once it's there, it's
Okay.
herpes virus.
Okay. For life.
Yeah, so now here's a situation where we have the same little ponies, and instead of deworming just the one in red with a high worm egg count, we've decided we're going to deworm a whole lot of them. So what are we left with?
Only the drug-resistant
Not
ones.
a pretty
Okay.
picture.
Then they
That
can
is the
breed and
crux of
make
the
it even
matter.
more resistant.
Okay.
If you take nothing away from tonight's presentation, this is the most important aspect to take away.
Do we have another slide? No. Oh, is that it? Sorry, I was waiting there with bated breath to see what was going to say. To follow on from when and why retests should be done, can a horse's low count, say it's 250, ultimately drop to 0?
Yes, yeah, we see that not infrequently, where a low count of 250 today might be 300 tomorrow, or might be 100 tomorrow.
Well, that's interesting. The population can...
It's never, you could take, we test 4 gram aliquots. So you could take a few 4 gram aliquots. I could take, a horse's can pass a pile of poo, and I can do a worm count on each different fecal ball in there, and I'll get slightly different figures. They won't all be 250 across the board. They'll vary a little bit, but you won't get a 250 and a 2,500 in the next fecal ball and a 0. They'll all tend to be either high or low. And that's how biology is. So it's not an exact science. It gives you an indication, and there's always the possibility that a horse carries immature parasites only. They haven't reached sexual maturity. They're not making any eggs. They haven't started to procreate. And so therefore, you will think the horse has got no worms when you might have a heavy burden of immature worms. But if you, we generally try and have another test done a month later if they've got a low count, just to be sure that we don't let any with a high
Any juvenile
immature
delinquents slip past.
through
Okay.
the
Any of your frenemies overstep a boundary.
yeah.
Is there anything, Alison, that you want to add?
I think one of the most important things with the gastrodiscus as well, to just, Karl can maybe chat to us about that. Often they can show a negative test.
Yeah, so what happens with the gastrodiscus? The snail is the intermediate host, and then it releases a metacercaria that insists on the grass. That insistment happens, say, in March, April, May. The horses then eat that grass, or that grass gets cut and taken to a horse's stable. He eats this insisted little metacercaria on the grass, and then it takes 60 days for them to reach sexual maturity from the time they've eaten the metacercaria. So there is that chance that you could be testing too early in the year and miss gastrodiscus. But if the gastrodiscus have been there from previous years, you won't miss it. You could test it any time of the year, you will pick it up. But if there's one cycle per year. So you ideally want to be testing from about June, July, August. And I've had some that have only become positive in November. So that's a very pertinent, a very good question that could be testing too early. And
so when should people, if people want to embark on this program, can they send their fecal samples into their vets tomorrow? And then from then on, how often, assuming that they've got a clean horse with some local frenemies and, well-behaved juvenile delinquents, how often should they test? Annually? Should they test twice a year?
I think it depends on the property. So if the property hasn't got gastrodisc, you never need to test again. Once you've established that your property is gastrodiscus hostile, there's no flays on bogs and dams and rivers, and you haven't got an infected snail, then you need to test no further. Problem is you can import horses from another yard, for example, that bring the gastrodiscus. So that's
all the more reason to quarantine a horse when it arrives.
Yeah,
you're not certain of where it's come from.
Okay.
And if it's showing any signs of like weight loss, unexplained weight loss or diarrhea or niggly colics or something, it beholds you to maybe just do a worming count plus a gastrodiscus because it is becoming so prevalent in Southern Africa.
And if you've had I don't want to say a clean flay, but you haven't had issues with gastrodiscus before, is it possible that it can start and then you'll have to start testing at some point?
Yes, it is possible. So to that end, I enjoy, as I said, natural history. I went to Ritflay, that little park near Centurion, the game park. I went driving around on a Sunday. I know you're not allowed out of your car, but I saw some zebra and they were pooing. And I went like leopard crawl up to the poo, grab a fecal ball, and by the time I had...
There's actually a comment here. It's Ritflay Farm. They want to arrest you. Oh, I'm joking. Carry on.
So I managed to look at 5 zebras poo from Ritflay, and they were all gastrodiscus free. So the nice take home is that they probably got the snail, but they're clean snails. So by staying on top of the problem, I think you can get clean snails and you can get safe water bodies again.
That's great. Thanks. Alison, is there anything else you want to...
No, just to say that it's been fantastic working with Karl because we also used to advise deworming every year in spring and this and that, and it was very prescriptive. And now we try and work according to the results we get, and then Karl's always fantastic in that he'll advise us, let's try with this horse. This is when we're going to retest it. This is, we have a whole plan. So it's not just about the test that gets done. You have this whole backup with all the knowledge
and creating almost a bespoke deworming approach then, I think.
So that we know that we're on top of all the problem children and that
the juvenile delinquents.
The juvenile delinquents going forward. And I have a couple of, even my own secretary, Cheryl, she's got a fat little pony that constantly has a high fecal egg count, and we can't understand because it should be nice and slim with all those worms, but it just obviously has a very happy relationship.
A very good symbiotic.
Exactly. So we have a little program for those fat little ponies.
So that's great to know that there are these options for horse owners to fall back on.
Yeah. And that everything will, through the vets, and Karl's fantastic with working with us and advising us that we have a plan to get on top of the problem.
With his frenemies.
Yeah, I feel I've done 40 plus years to the industry, and it's time to give back to the industry. The industry's been good to me. So if I can do something for the horse, I'm not doing this for me or for Wormex Lab. I'm doing this for the benefit of the horse. And I want to bring this awareness. And that's all I want to do.
I think that's lovely. I think we all can pay it forward in our sport and the industry that we love. For that. There's a comment from Karen to say, thank you, Alison and Karl, for your work. Much appreciated. So I also want to say thank you. Karl, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thanks once again for this opportunity.
You didn't, are those your snails? Is that what you were showing us? Oh, I thought we had missed a jar. Okay.
No.
I don't want to leave any worm unturned before we go.
It's been a wonderful opportunity to put the other side of the scenario across, and hopefully we will not deworm our horses the way our forefathers used to do. Hopefully we will assess what we're doing and change potentially in our ways and do things for the better.
And I can say a lot of the pharmaceutical companies have been great at working with us, and they've also got Karl on board to advise them. Some of the advertising that we were concerned about, they've decided to relook at the wording so that the horse owner out there can be educated.
Not the broad. Are you going against the broad spectrum?
Or there were some that were called the switch dewormers. I was like, that's creating the wrong. I spoke to some of them, and they were like, no, we work.
And they were actually on board. That's fantastic.
On board, so that they've been fantastic as well to try and educate our horse owners what's best for their horse.
It's easy to get locked into marketing, I think, and wanting to promote your product, and then actually to do something ethical is really important.
Yeah.
And good for the whole industry.
And it has just become so complex, and so it's like a chess game. You want to land up calling checkmate on the worms, and not the little worm with his little one single ganglion cell outsmarting the age-old stud master.
That's again a lovely. I love your analogies, Karl. They really are great. Thank you both for making time in your busy schedules and your week that you're out here for the South African Veterinary Congress. Karl, we really appreciate you coming to chat to us.
Thank you for the invite.
Thanks for having us.
To everyone who joined tonight, thank you so much for joining us. This was the 11th podcast from the South African Equestrian Federation, From the Horse's Mouth. We will see you next week. I believe next week we are going to be doing a discipline spotlight on driving with Wayne van Niekerk. So please join us on Wednesday at 7 p.m. next week. And good luck with all your worms.